nothing to do with history. Sovereignty lies with the people, and all men should have a say in the election of the governments that rule them. And 1688 didn't do that, but the revolutions in the North American colonies and the revolution in France comes much closer to the ideal. And then, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first leading feminists in Britain, argues not that women should also have the vote, but that women should have the education so that they might be part of the public discussion of the nature of the state. Now, the publication of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man really energizes a radical reforming movement. And there are basically three key organisations that advance these arguments for radical reform. The Society for Constitutional Information, headed up by Major John Cartwright, the Friends of the People in Scotland, and the London Corresponding Society in London, which was pledged to a Paineite agenda, and opened itself up to supposedly members unlimited, i.e. to all people. And finally, the United Irishmen in Ireland, led by the Protestant lawyer Wolfe Tone. Pledged, it was formed in 1792, the United Irishmen pledged to obtain, quote, an equal, full and adequate representation of all the people of Ireland, irrespective of their religion. Okay? So Tone is basically a Protestant lawyer arguing that all people in Ireland, not just Protestants, should have the vote. Okay, I'm not going to pause for questions because I have about 10 minutes to finish off this packed, caffeine-fueled lecture. The growth of the radical reform movement is truly scary for the defenders of the status quo and of the new type of imperial state. In 1792, the king makes a proclamation against seditious writing, and Paine is immediately arrested, as is his publisher. In August of 1792, the Republic is declared in France, and by January 1793, the king is executed there, and Republican France declares war upon Britain. This fuels a loyalist backlash. In 1792, a new organisation, the Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levellers, could claim over 2,000 local groups affiliated to it. And this wave of loyalist support, of patriotic loyalist support, was whipped up by new government-funded newspapers with titles like The Sun, not like The Sun that is currently published in Britain, The True Briton, and The Anti-Jacobin. The very titles give you a sense of their politics. And satirical artists like James Gilroy are hired to portray radicals in demonising ways. But it wasn't just about the mobilisation of people in support of church and state. It was also about the application of a new wave of state violence, what the radicals would end up describing as Britain's system of terror, in reference to the terror that was developing in the French Revolution. The leaders of the Scottish Friends of the People were charged with sedition and transported to Australia in 1793. The leaders of the London Corresponding Society and the Society for Constitutional Information were arrested for treasonable practices in 1794. Habeas corpus, the right to appear before a court when you're arrested, was suspended in order to deal with radical leaders. None of this put out the fire of radical reform. And in 1795, the London Corresponding Society manages to get 10,000 people to this meeting in London's Copenhagen fields. But the meeting breaks up, and members of the meeting end up throwing stones at the king's carriage on his way to open Parliament. Okay? This is basically the end. And immediately, a whole series of new repressive measures are introduced. In 1795, the Gagging Acts, which allowed magistrates to basically outlaw all potentially seditious public meetings. It expanded the definition of what treason was, and completely served to close down the movement for radical reform. The following year, the rebellion of the United Irishmen across the sea between 1796 and 1798 is brutally crushed at the cost of 12,000 Irish lives. And then finally in 1799 and 1800, the Combination Acts are introduced that allowed magistrates to imprison anyone for 3 months that sought to create an organisation of working men, of any type of association. Radicalism, it's been argued, went underground as a consequence of that. It didn't go away. And it revives with the return of peace at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars, the wars with revolutionary France, basically lasted 22 years and had cost over £1 billion and had meant that the national debt had grown to an unprecedented level of £745 million. This led to a series of retrenchment measures by the state, which I don't have time to detail, that created new levels of austerity and hardship for most of the population, and significantly was combined with the introduction of the Corn Laws to protect British agriculture from the import of cheap grain from overseas, to protect, in other words, the aristocratic interests of landowners who owned the land that was farmed, and not to protect the rights of ordinary Britons. So into this mess of a very costly war and new levels of austerity, a new generation of radical leaders like William Cobbett and Henry Hunt arise from the ashes. Cobbett has his political register. There's also a famous radical magazine called a newspaper called The Black Dwarf, and all of them highlight the extent of all corruption, the extent of the tax burden, and the tyrannical violence that was rained down on the people. There are a variety of attempts at insurrection across Britain in 1816 and 1817, an attempt to create an insurrection in London's Spa Fields, in Manchester with the Blanketers' March, in Derbyshire with the so-called Pentrick Rising. All of these are very small, okay, but it shows that insurrection is growing around the country. And by 1819, the calls for radical reform had grown so large, with Henry Hunt at the lead of the movement, that a huge crowd of 50,000 people gather in central Manchester on St. Peter's Fields in August 1819 to hear Henry Hunt, the great orator, argue for the necessity of radical reform. The local magistrate reads the Riot Act and sends in the cavalry. 14 men and 4 women are killed as a consequence of their stampede of the proceedings. A further 650 people, including over 150 women, were injured. And the editor of the local newspaper, the Manchester Observer, Edward Rowe, and you can read this online, published a report of what he termed the Peterloo Massacre, referring to, obviously, the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. After Peterloo, the infamous 6 Acts are introduced. Any reform meeting that seems to be an overt act of treasonable conspiracy was outlawed. The radical press was muzzled with new stamp duties, new taxes on publication. There were stricter definitions of blasphemy and seditious libel, and the magistrates were given new powers to prevent any type of meeting over 50 people. This was the final triumph, I'm suggesting, of the new imperial state that had been established in the wake of the Revolution of 1688. That it takes over a century for that state to have the might and the security to contain its critics overseas and at home. And I will go straight into some final words so we can all breathe. So, very quickly, what I've been trying to convey to you today, is that the first part of the story is that a new type of state grew in the aftermath of the revolutionary settlement of 1688 to 1714. A new type of fiscal military state was engrafted on top of the older structures of that state. And that created something that looked far from an omnipotent state, but actually a composite state with highly decentralized powers. Okay? And that created the forums, if you like, the representative systems that allowed eventually for a critique of that new state to emerge. And that critique centered upon, whether it was in the American colonies or whether it was in London or in Manchester, that critique focused upon the corrupt use of government offices, the extent of the tax burden upon the British people, and the use of arbitrary power to suppress alternative points of view. All of those things were true across the British Empire, from South Asia to North America to Britain. And this shows the tightening grip of a new type of imperial state, that the very creation of that state catalyzes its critics across its imperial reach. Those critics are then met with an unprecedented level of state violence and repression. So a state that putatively is set up with some measure of popular sovereignty, some claim to be representative of the people, ends up creating all of these emergency laws and conditions in which new forms of state violence can be enacted. And I'm suggesting that that is representative of the fragility of that new state and its ability to overcome, ultimately, that fragility through its use of violence. So, in other words, Britain becomes the preeminent state, world state, in 1815, certainly the preeminent European state after centuries of war, not because the British people are inherently brilliant at creating forms of stable government, but out of a deeply contentious and conflictual process. And that was the real legacy of the long 18th century in Britain. And on that note, I will end. And I do promise you that I will not have so much ground to cover. I had to give you, get you deeply into the 18th century. So this is a truly intense week with a lot of reading and a very busy lecture. And next week, I hope, will be a little bit easier.